landing craft have been disembarked from their motherships and are moving in long, irregular lines toward the horizon of France, which is very plain to the naked eye. Our own bombardment fleet, lying out beyond us, has begun to blast the shoreline, and we can see the vivid yellow bursts of flames quite clearly, although the sound is too far away to be heard, and at the same time, from the shore, are answering yellow flames as the Nazi batteries are replying.
It's 5 a.m. on D-Day. Many of the landing craft have now begun grouping for their approach, and at the same time, there begins an intensified phase of bombardment to soften the designated landing sites.
The idea is to take out as many of the German defenses and hazards as possible before the men and machines land an hour and a half from now. It does not go as planned. The fortified positions are mostly in a narrow path along the beach and spread out over long stretches of the shoreline.
The aerial bombardment suffers the usual problems of targeting and continues to strike more empty land and civilian targets than enemy positions.
Corporal Henrik Naube is a machine gunner with the 325th Infantry Division at Vierville. The position he is in is a set of machine gun nests connected by concrete trenches overlooking the beach in the Omaha sector. To protect themselves from bombardment in the trenches, all they have are heavy steel sheets that they use as lids to take cover under. This is how he will remember what happens shortly after 5 a.m. A very large formation of enemy bombers came over us. We saw them streaming towards us over the ships on the sea, and a nearby 20mm flak gun fired on them, but they were too high in altitude. They bombed us, and we threw ourselves under the steel covers, fearing the worst. These bombs came down at an angle from the sky, diagonally out of the sky, and the explosions made the whole cliff shake and sway under us. But we realized that they were missing us, if we were the target, and the bombs hit the inland areas behind us. This was a great relief, and we laughed in a nervous, apprehensive manner as the sound of the planes moved away inland too.
One of the most intense areas of bombardment in that sector is at Pointe du Hoc, the artillery installation towards which the U.S. Rangers are headed. It's 5 a.m. With a light fog hovering over the sea, the Germans at Pointe du Hoc can now see the silhouette of hundreds of ships approaching their clifftop positions in the pre-dawn light. But it isn't just ships. The skies are filling with planes. The Lancasters make their bombing runs just after the hour begins, bombarding Pointe du Hoc for about half an hour, showering the site with 635 tons of bombs. This destroys virtually everything except the bomb-proof shelters. Few trenches or roads escape harm, and the entrances to many of the personnel shelters and ammunition bunkers are buried. The number of German casualties in the raid was never recorded. Many of the survivors were deafened from punctured eardrums or other concussion injuries. The air raid had a debilitating effect on the morale of the survivors. This is true, but the control team in the command bunker, the machine gun crews, and the AA bunker, they're still all right, as are many troops digging their way out, though many have been killed or buried alive. However, the Germans are fighting back. At 5:01, a squadron of 4 Focke-Wulf bombers, led by Helmut Eberspacher, is airborne, and they spot a bomber group finishing its run. The fighting in the sky over the next 3 minutes is the first aerial engagement of D-Day. Eberspacher shoots down 3 Lancasters. He writes in his logbook, "I noticed above a row of British bombers flying below the moonlit cloud cover. Similar to a shadow theater, the bombers stood out against the clouds. However, they could not see me against the dark earth. Within a few minutes, 3 British Lancaster bombers went down in flames. Now it was high time that I landed somewhere as not to become another casualty of the morning invasion." As for the landing craft at sea, slowly making their way in, at 5:15, one of the supply LCAs sinks, followed several minutes later by the second because of the waves and the overloaded ships. At 5:30, LCA 860 carrying Harold Slater and 20 men from Company D, Force A, sinks. 4 of the men drown, and the others will not be rescued for several hours and suffer badly from exposure. In fact, the sea swells are so high that men in many craft are bailing water with their helmets since the pumps can't keep up. This flotilla of landing craft is led by a Fairmile motor launch, commanded by British Lieutenant Colin Beaver, who is to get them all to Pointe du Hoc. He's been navigating using two methods, QH2 radio navigation and Type 970 radar. It's a tough job in any case since the tide is running to the east and much of the voyage is made in darkness and strong winds. But on top of that, by now, both navigation systems have failed because of a bad power supply. So Beaver now pilots by dead reckoning and visual recognition. He expects the enemy battery at Pointe du Hoc to be firing, which will reveal its location for him to make for. But the cliffs are covered in smoke, so as the hour comes to its end, he mistakenly leads the flotilla in the wrong direction, guiding them to Pointe de la Percée, east of Pointe du Hoc. It's not a stupid mistake though. From the sea, they do look pretty similar. At 5:40 a.m., 4 Duck Vs are sent into the water from 4 kilometers out. They will join the flotilla. These have been fitted with 30-meter extendable ladders from the London Fire Brigade to help the Rangers climb to Pointe, with a pair of 303 Lewis guns at the top of each ladder. There are, though, bigger guns that are about to really get going, for late in the hour, the naval bombardment begins. At 5:50, the 14-inch guns of the Texas opened fire on the relatively small area of Pointe du Hoc, the great ship leaning sideways in the water from the force of the blast. Long tongues of fire flew from the muzzle. Those nearby felt the air sucked from their lungs, and smaller vessels and their crews shuddered from the shock. The Texas was firing over the head of many landing craft, and to men therein, it seemed as though freight trains were rumbling above them. In support of the landing at Pointe du Hoc, the Texas would fire 690 shells from its 14-inch batteries, and another 272 rounds of 5-inch ammunition aimed primarily at Omaha Beach targets. The big guns of the battleship Texas, battleship Arkansas, British destroyer HMS Talibant, and American destroyers Satterley and Thompson have launched what will be a half-hour bombardment against Pointe du Hoc and this end of Omaha Beach. They do a great deal of damage to the pont, smashing craters all over and crumbling sections of the cliffs to the ground. And just before the hour ends, the sun rises. In the waters off Omaha, Goranson and his men can see the shapes of the landing craft of Company A 116th Infantry to their left. About 4 kilometers from the shore, they begin to fan out for their final run to Omaha.
Unlike the aerial bombardment we saw an example of at Vierville, the naval bombardment is accurate. Still, destroying stationary defenses is not as easy as one might think. When we imagine these things, it's hard to factor in the real scope of it all. On a map, it looks fairly straightforward. You aim for a given Widerstandsnest and hit it with some really heavy shells, and it's destroyed. Bob's your uncle.
In reality, though, there are many fortified positions to hit. They are not at all close together, and it's not enough to just hit them. The hit has to be at the right place with the right force. To pierce the thick concrete, it's often not enough to hit something just once either. Even with the massive amount of guns and ammunition the Allies have here, you can only fire so many shells in a given time period. The gunners and the ballistic engineers are very good at their craft, yeah, sure, but there are still lots of things that can alter a shell's trajectory just enough for it to miss, especially if your gun is on a ship in the water with waves and with wind moving it around. Just a few millimeters change of angle translate to several meters by the time the shell arrives.
Then there's the fact that defenses are in depth. That is to say, they have several lines of defense, and some features inland can't be destroyed by the guns because that would later hinder the advance of the infantry. That is, for instance, the case with the causeways behind Utah Beach.
Okay, the causeways, those between Utah Beach and the airborne troops that we keep hearing about. What's the deal? Okay, there's a road that runs parallel to the coast from Saint-Marie-du-Mont up to Saint-Marcouf and then even further north. There are 7 little roads that run at right angles from the coast and hit that road. These are what the attackers call the causeways. They are the only way to get off the beaches in force, and their capture is a major priority. The Allied planners, however, don't really fancy the 3 that are furthest north up towards Saint-Marcouf. They think they're too close to the enemy positions and too underwater. Yeah, I just said that, 2 underwater. But the other 4, that's how the men and machines will hopefully get off Utah Beach this day. Number 1 to Poupeville and number 2 to Saint-Maurice-du-Mont are targets of the 506 PIR, and numbers 3 to Andouille-la-Hubert and 4 to Saint-Martin-de-Varaville are for the 502nd. They need to clear them for the men hitting Utah Beach to come at from the other side. There are a few Widerstandsnests along the actual beach here, numbers WN1 to WN11, from Le Grand Ve heading up the coast to north of where the landings are to take place, placed over a kilometer apart, featuring the usual machine guns, mortars, and the occasional heavier gun, some in the open and some concrete enclosed, and with barbed wire and minefields. The defenders are a mixed bag. Fallschirmjäger around Carentan, groups from the 709th or 91st Divisions holding places in various local villages, and on the west coast of the peninsula, the 243rd Division. Along the coast from Cherbourg to the Carentan Canal is Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben's 709th, whose average age is 36. He also has 4 battalions of Osttruppen, who we see elsewhere today in coastal defenses, which has led to his most excellent observation. We are asking rather a lot if we expect Russians to fight in France for Germany against Americans. Although, to get it out of the way, that is a real generalization for an awful lot of men, many of whom are in fact determined quality fighters, many of whom also aren't. But that is not the main issue. His primary problem was that none of his defenses possessed depth, for the beachfront fortifications could not hope to contain an assault for very long. They were spread along the littoral, acting as outposts, main lines of resistance, and depth positions all rolled into one, in defiance of all German military doctrine. And while on, say, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, there are villas and hotels by the sea that can be fortified for defense purposes. That is not the case here on Carentan. There is the 4-gun Azeville battery. It's huge, with 4 giant concrete casemates housing French 105mm cannons, which can fire over 11 kilometers range. There are 3 210mm concrete encased guns at Saint-Marcouf, and a concrete encased battery at Saint-Martin-de-Varaville, WN-108. The WN-100s in this region are behind the coast, not on it, with 4 122mm guns. But again, there is no real defense in any sort of depth. Well, in front of Utah Beach, the first engines are heating up. Admiral Don Moon, in command of Naval Task Force 125, has allocated 3 specialized patrol crafts for each sector to go in and prepare a path for the successive waves of landing craft to follow. The coxswains of these crafts, called Force U, have the best navigational instruments and electronic devices available and can land with pinpoint accuracy on the shore. Once in place, they are to ensure that the other men land on Utah Beach at the right place at the right time. But things do not go as smoothly as the Admiralty has hoped they will. At 5:45, one of these 6 specially equipped patrol craft of Force U hits a German mine. The massive explosion tears apart the ship, throwing cargo and men into the sea. Another patrol vessel suffers the same fate about 10 minutes later. These explosions cause other ships to stray off course, as this part of the sea should be cleared of mines by now. They're also exposed to the extremely unpredictable Normandy currents, which can, and do, suddenly shift from one direction to the other. This is especially fierce in front of Utah Beach. With a peak of 6 kilometers or so, the current can flow from north to south for hours, and then suddenly reverse and flow the opposite direction. There are also secondary currents surging in from the eastern side of the Cotentin, and those from the southeastern part of the peninsula where the Douve and Vire rivers meet the sea. All these currents seemingly randomly push and pull against the landing craft and can throw off even the most experienced coxswains with their modern equipment, calculations, facts, and figures. And since the invasion was planned to start at low but rising tide, these currents are building up their momentum and should peak shortly after H hour. Well, at 5:50 a.m., Naval Force U opens fire on the Utah Beach batteries, which themselves opened fire a few minutes earlier. Naval Force U features the battleship Nevada, a Monitor, and 5 cruisers, and far beneath the shell fire, the men slowly approached the shore.
That naval bombardment also starts towards the batteries behind Omaha.
It's a pretty massive force of heavy ships. Beyond the ships I just mentioned, commanded by Rear Admiral Deo in front of Utah, the force in front of Omaha, under command of Rear Admiral Bryant, has 2 battleships, Texas and Arkansas, and 3 cruisers, 1 British and 2 French.
Nice seeing Nevada again, right, Indy?
Yeah, totally. Because she became our friend when we did our Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute series.
She's also the most powerful ship on the stretch of coast right now, with her 10 14-inch guns, 16 5-inch guns, and modernized fire control equipment. In total, the big guns firing on the Utah sectors are 2 15-inch, 10 14-inch, 27 8-inch, 7 7.5-inch, and dozens of 5 to 6-inch guns.
Hitting the defenses at Omaha are a bunch of 12-inch guns on the 2 older battleships and a load of 6 and 4-inch guns on the cruisers. As we said earlier, and Corporal Henrik Naube now notices, the naval artillery is far more accurate and devastating than the aerial bombardment that failed to hit them at the top of the hour.
I had been under artillery fire on the Eastern Front, of course, where I learned to brace myself against it both physically and mentally. That was difficult enough for me and for most others. This bombardment, however, was by warship cannons. That was obvious from the flashes that we could see on the horizon, among the many outlines of the advancing ships, and then the noise of the shells approaching us in the air. These shells made a noise similar to a gas blowtorch being run at full strength, and at first they passed right overhead. We could actually see them as bright shapes flying inland over the beach. Huge shapes, too, the size of a car engine or similar. They exploded a few hundred meters behind us, and then the next salvo came down much closer to us. We dragged the steel plates over our trench covers, and we huddled underneath them with our guns. The power of the explosions made the concrete of the trench ripple and fracture. And if I glanced up, I could only see enormous spouts of earth and sand hanging over the dunes and the beach. The shockwaves punched all the air out of our lungs and made our eyes bleed. The shrapnel that flew around us was monstrous in size. I saw one piece of shell case as big as my arm, which simply fell down out of the air and jangled at the end of the trench, still smoking. But other pieces were flying left and right horizontally, screeching and smashing off the parapet and the steel roof plates. It went on and on for salvo after salvo, with absolutely no pause in between the impacts. It was as if a gigantic hammer was falling on the beach, trying to pound it flat. That is how it felt to me. Most of us remained calm and disciplined. One man near me could not take the stress, and he tried to run by ducking outside of the trench zone, which was covered overhead by the steel screens. I saw him try to run. He was caught by an absolute storm of shrapnel, and his torso was ripped across and broken open. Absolutely ripped open from front to back. He fell in the open part of the trench, and countless other bits of debris fell on him, mutilating him further. His body produced a lot of steam in the cool air, which filled the trench for a while. It was a terrible, shocking sight for those of us who saw it. At one point, the end of the concrete trench was blown open by one of these shells, showering us with earth and debris. When the smoke from this cleared, it meant that we could see out of the end of the trench and down to the beach for some distance. It was possible to see the shells landing in salvos of 3. Each salvo made very tall plumes of smoke and debris that slowly fell to the ground. I saw one of the shells explode inside one of the other resistance points about 500 meters from us. That point was similar in design to ours, but with a single machine gun in a concrete to Brook bunker. The whole installation was destroyed, and pieces of concrete were thrown high into the air with the bodies of the men who were in it. It was terrifying to watch those men flung out, knowing that the same thing could happen to us if we were hit directly. In the end, however, there was a final intense fall of shells, and then the shelling stopped altogether. The cessation of the noise and blast waves came as a great relief, as you can appreciate. My ears were ringing, and I had blood on my face from my eyes.
While the attack on these men rains chaotic death in spectacular explosions on the coast, inland behind them, the chaos and death is more discreet and more personal, but still just as terrifying.
Around now, Rundstedt's headquarters is informed that the U.S. airborne have taken Sainte-Mère-Église, but the fighting there and everywhere on Cotentin is far from over.
If all World War II battles were to some extent chaotic, what transpired in the Cotentin Peninsula in the opening hours of the D-Day invasion can only be described as absolute bedlam. No historical account of this early fighting amid the dark, threatening hedgerows can ever be complete, since so many participants did not survive and so many more had no idea where they were. The situation of the hunted 2nd Battalion, 508th, has barely improved at this point. By now, Shanley has collected around 200 men and set up a position east of Picauville, but they have only 2 machine guns and no mortars or heavy weapons at their disposal. And with so many Germans between them and the objectives at either Beuzeville-la-Bastille and Etienneville, there is no way of achieving them. So to at least do something helpful, Shanley wants to seize a crossing of the Mer de Ray River and maybe move to a higher position, a place called Hill 30. At Lafayette Bridge, the men of the 505th and 507th, currently under Schwarzwälder and Dolan, were pinned down by the Germans from the manor house, but they start trying to work around to the enemy's flanks. The Americans are also moving on the bridge itself. If they hold the bridge, then all their comrades will have an easy time crossing the Mer de Ray when they arrive. But while the bridge is deserted, it's tough to make out what's happening on the other side, beyond the 600 or so meters of water. What is behind the other side of Lafayette Causeway is a small cluster of stone buildings called Calquigny. It is quite an eerie sight, like a haunted place amongst the gloom of the flooded plains, with an ancient, forsaken chapel right in the middle. Dolan sends men out there to check for movement. The Americans west of the Mer de Ray are under increasing pressure from the Germans. For most of them, there is little choice other than trying to hold on to their positions until more firepower arrives with the gliders. From 4 a.m., in fact, the 437th Troop Carrier Groups approach 505th drop zone near Sainte-Mère-Église. 52 gliders bringing reinforcements, 16 57mm anti-tank guns, and 220 more troops. Flying straight through enemy fire, they are very lucky that only one of them is shot down, but many tow cables are cut. This leads to many gliders over or undershooting their landing zones west of the Mer de Ray. In the dark of night, many of these Wacos either crash or land right at the feet of the German patrols. Only half of those guns will ever reach the men. One very notable crash victim is Don Pratt. The glider he is in comes down okay, actually, but the wet grass causes it to skid without slowing when they hit the brakes, and it overshoots its target and hits a hedgerow. Whiplash breaks Pratt's neck and he dies. He is a brigadier general and second in command of the 101st Airborne. He is the highest ranking Allied soldier killed this day. As for the action nearer the coast, it is before sunrise that Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's band of brothers reaches Causeway 3. Time is really running out. The landings will soon be underway. If they cannot push the enemy off the ridge overlooking the causeway, they at least have to make such a ruckus that the enemy's attention is diverted from the beaches. But as they approach the ridge overlooking the flooded pastures behind Utah, well, there's no enemy. Cole remarks how very strange it is that the enemy has not chosen to fight for such an important tactical objective. At the hamlets that opposed Ballard's 2nd Battalion of the 501st, however, there is indeed a fight happening. The Americans approach the enemy position from all sides, trying to flush the Germans out by a daring all-in attack. Dawn was cracking as the companies moved out of the fields and down the hedgerows towards Saint-Côme-du-Mont, which Ballard proposed to assault immediately. Company E had already worked forward as far as the bend in the road when rifle and automatic fire, seeming to come from enemy positions grouped closely around the houses, broke all around it and stopped the advance. The bullet fire ranged down both sides of the road and was also picking away at the embankment of the forward hedgerows. A curtain of mortar fire dropped down on both roads and the field lying between them. The men of Company E went flat in the ditches almost instantly and remained there inert. Ballard had felt the pressure sufficiently that he was certain the enemy force intended to stand its ground. The fight for Poupeville between Ewell's gang and men of the 91st Luftlande Division has gone on for quite some time now and is becoming more and more sporadic. It has been intense with big casualties on both sides, but the Germans have been pushed out of the center of the village. Well, they will be by shortly after the end of the hour. Or not. There are several sources that paint a picture of this not happening for several more hours, and there are, in fact, several that say Ewell does not even arrive on the scene until 9 a.m. Anyhow, Ewell himself is nearly killed when a rifle bullet glances off his helmet, but they soon secure causeway number 1. Causeway number 2, the one exit that leads to Saint-Marie-du-Mont, is still in German hands though. But this means in general that the 101st might be turning the tables. The trappers may very well soon become the trapped. And then it will be the German soldiers defending Utah Beach that are caught between the hammer of the invasion force and the anvil of the men at the ends of the causeways. As dawn approaches, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timms of the 2nd Battalion 507th, whose job is to secure Coquigny, approaches the village of Amphéville. However, after seeing the many German soldiers all over the area, Timms chooses to withdraw and instead move to secure the Lafayette Causeway from the other side. Around the ancient chapel, his men set up a defensive perimeter. The many hedgerows offer perfect concealment, and the strong stone walls of the church will be hard to penetrate. It seems like their mer de raid is now ready to be crossed, and all that is left for them to do is to wait for the 4th Division to show up. Unless, of course, the enemy shows up before the 4th does. Unless.
The sun rises over the horizon in Normandy at 2 minutes to 6. So like Indy just noted, dawn has been rising throughout this hour.
For the men on the ground, daylight brings new dangers as they are no longer protected by darkness.
But it also brings new possibilities when you can see what you and your enemy are doing and where you are going. On that note, Indy has a story for us from the 6th Airborne over at the eastern end of the attack zone.
I'm going to spin you a yarn now. Remember those guys from 8th Battalion who dropped near Ranville instead of to the south and thought they could blow some of the Dives bridges themselves? Well, there is word from them and some more detail about their journey. See, a Lieutenant Thompson reports to 8th Battalion headquarters. He says that he landed on the Ranville drop zone with the battalion mortars and machine guns at 1 a.m. At 2 a.m., he left that drop zone with the objective of making for Troarn, not knowing where the rest of the battalion was. In Ranville, they met a local who said that he would guide them, and they went along the Ranville-Le Mesnil road to road junction 140704, where he meets Tim Rosevier, engineer, who commands 3rd Parachute Squadron Royal Engineers, who are actually tasked with destroying the Dives bridges. These are the 50 or so guys with 45 demolition charges and 230 kilos of explosive we met before when they set out. They were on foot for a while, but a jeep and trailer belonging to 224 Parachute Field Ambulance happened by, and Rosevier commandeered it. That is the jeep and trailer I mentioned landed a few hours ago. It was full of medical supplies bound for Le Mesnil, but the other mission has priority. When Rosevier meets Thompson, he orders his party to hold the junction, since he has no idea where the rest of the battalion is. Thompson organizes the defense of the road junction, then heads down the road to do recon, where he meets units at crossroads 146695, who direct him to 8th Battalion headquarters. Commander Pearson tells him to bring his men to the battalion area. They will arrive there at 6:15. As for Rosevier and his jeep and his explosives, he and it and a few sappers head for Troarn in the jeep. He does, though, send Captain Tim Jukes with the rest of the sappers toward Burr to destroy the bridges there. And then his gang continues towards Troarn, right? Okay. They reach it and take out a sentry, but do it loudly, alerting the Germans in the town. So they cruise through the town as fast as they can, which is no more than 60 or so kilometers an hour since they're carrying a heavy load, exchanging fire with what seems like an enemy soldier in every doorway. According to Rosevier, what saves them is that the main street is a steep hill downward, so they pick up enough speed to exit the town, careening from side to side. One sapper falls out and is taken prisoner, and leaving town to the tune of machine gun tracer bullets above their heads. At 5 a.m., they have blown a gap of 5 or 6 meters in the bridge at Trouarn. The bridge itself has been unguarded. Then Roseveare, wisely not wishing to go back to Trouarn, heads north on a farm track towards Bure. The track dead ends, so they leave the jeep and continue on foot. They skirt Bure since they think it's occupied, though it's not. By the afternoon, they will arrive at Le Mesnil.
Now, we've said it before, but blowing up that bridge and the other bridges on the Dives is an essential part in making sure the landings on the British Second Army beaches can take hold.
And the American First Army's landings have to hold. They are now being prepared by the U.S. Airborne. Everything happening today is interconnected.
In this interconnectedness of everything, as we saw last hour, the easternmost beach, Sword, and the westernmost beach, Utah, are at the strategic ends of the mission, enabling the next steps of Operation Overlord.
The beaches in the middle are the anchor of the whole operation, though. It is here that the Allies aim to establish their point of entry into France. A few hours ago in England, a long set of concrete barges, huge air-filled caissons, set sail for Normandy. When they arrive, they'll be sunk directly in front of the coast at Arromanches to create an artificial harbor with enough depth for bigger ships to moor to land.
We'll get back to these Mulberry harbors later in the day. Right now, what's important is that Arromanches must be taken and held. The little holiday resort is situated right between the American and the British Canadian sectors, between Omaha Beach to its west and Gold Beach to its east.
Gold Beach, where units from 30th Corps are going to land. After making their way ashore, they'll swing to their right and link up with American 5th Corps, as well as with the Canadians on their left, as well as heading inland, taking Bayeux, and reaching the Caen-Carentan Road by the end of the day. That is all very ambitious.
The Germans do not expect a serious landing at or near Gold because of the steep bluffs past the shore in the west, where the shore is also very rocky. So any landing will be difficult. And the area between Asnel and Vers-sur-Mer is low-lying marsh as well. The rocky stretch with deeper waters in front is what enables the Mulberry Harbor and why the Allies need to land right next to it. But the Germans don't know about that plan, of course.
Like the other beaches, Gold is divided into sections, but 2 of them are too difficult to land on, and Love isn't going to be attacked from the sea at all, but will serve as landing point for equipment once the beach is held. The 2 sectors that will be hit are Mike and Nan.
And let's be clear, although they don't expect a major assault, there are German defenses around here. They're focused mainly on keeping any invader out of the existing harbors at Arromanches on the west and Courseulles on the east. So the seaward entrance has been fortified pretty well on both sides. But let's let Indy tell us more about the plan at Gold.
The British war planners have split Gold Beach into zones: Howe, Item, Jig, King, and Love, which are further broken down into red and green. Howe is the farthest to the west, and it has bluffs and rocks to the point that it really isn't at all viable as a landing spot. Item is much the same. The cliffs abruptly end east of Les Hamelles. Beyond, as far as the Orne River and Caen, lies a completely different geology: wide sand or shingle beaches and a deep coastal plain. All along this part of the coast, many seaside villages had grown up, connected by a narrow-gauge railway. The sea breaks on sand and clay between Arromanches and La Rivière, which is more like it for making a landing. This area is, however, defended by the Germans with a fairly complex system of mined defense points. Widerstandsnest 39 is up on the cliff between Arromanches and Saint-Comet. It's got a Würzburg radar station, 2 75mm field guns in concrete casemates, and it's backed by WN-38 with 2 50mm guns. At Jig Green are 2 Widerstandsnests numbers 37 and 36, another 75mm gun at Asnel, which can rake the beach with flanking fire, and the second one along the coastal road to the east, and with machine guns and a 50mm gun. These are protected by mines, barbed wire, and an anti-tank ditch. In the center is WN-35, 6 bunkers with no heavy guns but with machine guns, and at the east end of Gold, WN-33 at La Rivière has a mighty 88mm cannon facing west along the beach, backed by a 50mm gun. In front of all of this in the water is plenty more to get through. In the deeper water, at some 230 meters out, are quintet elements, or Belgian gates. These heavy steel fences weigh over 1,280 kilos and are made for stopping power. Closer to the beach are hembalken, with ramps to slide incoming craft up into posts tipped with mines and shells. Then, at the high water mark by the beach, are Czech hedgehogs. These are some of the typical World War II defenses deployed as anti-tank or generally anti-vehicle barriers. They are known as Czech because they were at first part of the Czech border defenses against a German invasion pre-1938 and the Munich Agreement. These are 3 or more steel girders bolted together in the center and stand 1.7 or so meters high. Jig Red has rows of Czech hedgehogs and behind them a 6-row minefield that covers half of Jig Red and then all of King Green, which also has more Czech hedgehogs. At King Red, they can also use the houses for defense. They've been boarded up and turned into armed strongpoints, supported by the battery at Montfleury. The defense units here are a mixed bag. Dietrich Kreis has from his 352nd Division the 1st Company of the 916th Grenadier Regiment at the western positions, which are pretty strong. But in the center, he has the 3rd Company from the 441st Ost Battalion. This is 1,000 Osttruppen supervised by 260 German officers and NCOs. The 4th Company from the Ost Battalion is in the east of the zone, backed by a company of the 736 Regiment. So, what you have is elements of 3 different units spread out here, which is because this is the boundary between Kreis' division and Richter's 716th Division. And you can see that Kreis really doesn't think they'll attempt a landing here, since those Osttruppen are pretty lightly armed, being just an internal security force. And even as for heavy weapons, they have only half the machine guns and mortars of the other similar-sized units. The defenders' dilemma here was similar as for those at Utah Beach. They were thinly dispersed along a strip of coast in positions that had no depth and were too far apart to offer mutual fire support. Penetration of just one position would result in the rest being rolled up from the flanks or to the rear, which would be made easier by the lateral road that ran parallel to the coast behind the shoreline. Thus, these little forts could only hope to delay any penetration for a few hours at most. For the Allies here, Douglas Graham commands the 50th Northumbrian Division from 30th Corps. As lead formations today, he's sending the 231st Brigade to hit Jig and the 69th Brigade to hit King. So it's the 1st Battalion Dorset Regiment and 1st Battalion Royal Hampshire Regiment to hit Jig, followed by 2nd Devons. They'll ideally make for Arromanches and link up with the Americans. 47 Marine Commando will also land and head west to take Port-en-Bessin, though not in the first wave. The 6th Battalion Green Howards and the 5th Battalion East Yorkshire Regiment are to hit King, with the 7th Green Howards in reserve. Armor from the 8th Armor Brigade, with plenty of DDs, is coming in early too. That's the Sherwood Rangers, the 4th, 7th Dragoons, the 24th Lancers, and the 147th Field Regiment. So, overall, 50th Northumbrian Division today, which also has artillery, tank, assault, AA, anti-tank, signals, and field ambulance companies, has a strength of 18,381 men. And though, in theory, as you might expect from its name, it's recruited from the northeast of England, all of the 231st Brigade's battalions are from the south. And in fact, far fewer than half the division's men come from the Tyne and Tees Rivers region. The Anglo-Canadian sector really begins east of Omaha at the little village of Port-en-Bessin, with its little harbor and a road that leads to 10 kilometers south to Bayeux. It has 3 Widerstandsnests, WN-56, with 2 guns covering the port, and 58 and 57, which cover the heights to the east and west in concrete emplacements. It is important to take today as the boundary between 1st and 2nd Armies where they can easily liaise. And indeed, they do plan to set up headquarters here. But also, this is where part of Pluto, the pipeline under the sea, is to come ashore. So they will have gasoline and oil storage depots here as well. 47 Royal Marine Commando is responsible for taking this after landing at Asnel, between Idem and Jig, and marching the 12 or 13 kilometers west to the little port. 5:15 a.m. Force G is pulling into position at sea. There are 8 LSIs, and each carries 18 LCAs hanging from the davits. Cruisers Orion, Ajax, Argonaut, Emerald, and Flores are close to the shore, fixing their aim on the coastal batteries that are their targets. The soon-to-be attackers have total surprise. 5:25. Assault groups are now getting lowered from the LCIs. The coastline is quite clear in the distance. The sea choppy and maybe too rough for the DD tanks, but should be okay for the LCs. From just after 5:30, the Eastern Task Force warships led by Rear Admiral Philip Vian opened fire on the British and Canadian beaches of Gold, Juno, and Sword. This is Task Forces K, E, and D. Radio silence is broken in the British and Canadian sector. The code word floater flashes through the air to the Sherwood Rangers and B and C squadrons of the Royal Dragoon Guards off Gold. This instructs them to launch their DD tanks and get them close to shore so they can start swimming. In the first few minutes after dawn, just as the sun rose into an overcast and storm-laden sky, medium and heavy bombers droned overhead to begin their bombing runs on the strong points of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Sheets of yellow flame and billowing clouds of smoke and dust began to mark the shoreline, and the rumble of huge detonations rippled across the sea. The bombardment was then taken up by the cruisers. Then, one by one, the flotilla of small vessels began to assemble and make for the shore, with spray flying over their blunt bows from the choppy seas. In the lead were the tank landing craft carrying the DD tanks, with the smaller assault landing craft weaving amongst them. On the flanks were rocket firing craft and tank landing craft with 4.7-inch guns. Protecting the flotillas from air attacks were the LCTFs, the cannon-firing anti-aircraft flak. And as the ships closed inexorably on the beaches, they too switched their attention to the beach defenses.
Talking about these beaches as places on a map, but as this morning arrives, it's only the Allies who have ever heard of these places. To the German defenders and the local populations, these divisions are unknown.
This is how Peter Caddick-Adams puts it in Sand and Steel. The Germans would have had no comprehension of the separate beach landings. On June 6th, the defenders were simply aware of attacks all along the coast. While we look back with hindsight at the beaches codenamed Omaha to Sword, this knowledge was of course denied to the Germans and indeed to the wider world at the time. To Generals Marx, Keiss, and Richter in their various headquarters, the realization of the separate divisions, and therefore defined beaches with operational boundaries, only came when they started capturing maps and interrogating prisoners. Of course, such knowledge would have helped the Germans immeasurably, for they merely needed to surround each individual beachhead, aware that in the first few hours they were all acutely vulnerable and each fighting their own battles for survival.
Okay, but on the Allied planners' maps, and in the heads of the Allied troops approaching the coast right now, bordering Gold to the east is Juno Beach, stretching from La Rivière to Saint-Aubin. This is roughly 9 kilometers. The beaches here are sandy, with dunes at the edges, but there is an offshore reef of rocks that are exposed when the tide is low, creating a substantial obstacle for the landing crafts. In terms of villages, in the west, there's the little port of Courseulles, where the river Seulles empties into the sea. Eastwards, there's Bernières-sur-Mer and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. These are little vacation getaways and have some pretty big villas here and there along the coast, private homes that are about to become a bloody battlefield.
It is the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, under Rod Keller, that's landing at Juno, part of British 1st Corps. The 7th and 8th Canadian Brigades, under Harry Foster and Kenneth Blackadder, assaulting the beaches. Courseulles is the main immediate target of 7th. Not so much because of the harbor, but because the river behind it being in German hands would prevent a link-up with British 50th Division to the west. The port is an actual fishing port and not a tourist center, so there's no promenade, which means the German defenses are right out at the beach and pretty obvious to any attacker. The Germans also know the importance of town and river. Other than the defenses at Omaha, the ones at Courseulles are the toughest along the invasion beaches. They have 3 main strongpoints here, manned by units from 736 Grenadier Regiment, Widerstandsnests 29, 30, and 31. WN 31 on the west bank has a 75mm gun in a concrete casemate sighted west for enfilading fire, as well as 3 50mm guns, machine guns, mortars, and a minefield in front. WN-29 is on the east bank. This has an anti-tank ditch in front and a full 88mm gun protected by reinforced concrete sited east along the beaches. This is backed in depth at a distance of a few hundred meters by 2 more 75s, a 50, and machine guns. WN-30 is further inland and is machine guns and mortars. As for 8th Brigade, who are to land further east, they are to take Bernières and Saint-Aubin. WN-28 protects the former. It has minefields to the front and anti-tank ditches to the rear. There are several positions under concrete around here. 75 and 50mm guns, machine guns, and mortars set up to watch over the exits from the beach. WN-27 is over by Saint-Aubin with a 50mm gun and machine guns, but here, the Germans have knocked down some houses to open up fields of fire. At the very western boundary of Juno, on a ridge overlooking Mike Green, is WN-33A. This is the headquarters of the 1st Company of the 441st Ost Battalion. The 3rd is at Gold, and features a 75mm big gun. None of the assault units are planning to attack that far west today, however. At the very east, beyond Saint-Aubin, is the village of Langrune, the boundary between Juno and Sword. It is not going to be attacked from the beaches today, but is to be assaulted by commando. More on that and its defenses later on. The main problem at Juno, with the defenses in general, is that they have many hundreds of men who will have to fight off many thousands of them. Those hundreds do have 5 field guns, 9 anti-tank guns, 7 mortars, and like 40 machine guns, and that is going to do some damage, sure. But they're sighted to make a killing zone by the actual shore. So once the invaders are inland, it's a lot easier for them because the positions are not sighted for mutual support. The attackers have support, though, in the borrowed form of the 26th and 80th Assault Squadron's Royal Engineers and the Sherman Crab flail tanks of the 22nd and the Westminster Dragoons, and Centaur tanks from the 2nd Royal Marines Armored Support Regiment. They have the 10th Armored Regiment, the Fort Garry Horse. They also have the 2 beach groups, number 7 and 8, so on top of his 15,000 or so strong division, Keller has another 9,000 odd men under his command.
Many of them are by now in boats on the water heading towards battle. Behind them, out at sea, there is suddenly already now battle.
Yeah, by now the coastal units of the Kriegsmarine have managed to get a couple dozen torpedo boats launched from several ports along the coast.
Most of them have either headed in the wrong direction because of the radar jamming and countermeasures they face, or failed to make enemy contact with the well-defended armada. Most, but not all.
5:10 a.m. The RAF lays a smokescreen to the east of Force S to shield it from the guns of Le Havre. A German torpedo boat soon enough takes advantage of this to shoot 15 torpedoes at Allied ships here. The Norwegian destroyer Svenner is hit to port just beneath her boiler room. She breaks in two and sinks, but most of the crew are rescued. 5:30. Troops start leaving the transport ships for the assault craft. This is a long and slow process at sea. Just before 6 a.m., the naval bombardment by Force S begins. Battleships Warspite and Ramillies and Monitor Roberts fire against the long-range enemy batters at Villeville, Benneville, and Oulgate with their big guns. Cruisers Scylla, Danai, Dragon, Frobisher, Arethusa, and Mauritius aim for the shore batteries and the local sword strongpoints. Okay, it's supposed to begin at 5:50, but many ships do begin firing earlier, with several ships claiming to be the first one firing on D-Day. 6 a.m. The LCAs carrying the infantry and the LCTs carrying the specialist armor from 79th Armored Division begin their journey to Queen Red and Queen White. They are guided in by midget submarine X-23.
That submarine?
Yeah.
It's one of two X-class submarines that have been out in front of the beaches for more than 2 days now.
Wow.
They surfaced early in the morning of the 5th, only to find out that the weather had postponed operations to the next day. So they had to dive again and wait for 24 hours. Yesterday evening, the crew on X-23 observed German soldiers playing football on the beach through their periscope. That's how close they are.
The X-Class are 52 feet long, 5 feet diameter mini-subs. That's 16 by 1.5 meters. Boats are always listed in feet. Armed with 2 torpedoes and a crew of 5. Leading up to Neptune, the X-23 and her sister ship X-20 have been essential in mapping the coastline, sounding the bottoms, and taking divers in to go ashore, scout defensive positions, and bring back samples of the sand and mud on the shore.
On top of the nautical charts they have created, they've photographed and measured out topographical charts of the beaches. These have been rendered into long drawings of the beach horizon as seen from the water, and are now being used by the landing craft pilots to find the landmarks they need to come in at the right place.
One of the crewmen on X-23 is Lieutenant Jim Booth. He will live until the year 2022 and the venerable age of 101. In 2014, age 93, he will again go down in a mini-submarine off the coast of Sword Beach, but that will be as a guest on an exploration submarine mapping and filming the wrecks left behind on this day.
Right now, his submarine is surfaced at the edge of the invasion as a light and radio beacon to make sure that no landing craft veers too far east, which would put them in range of the German coastal artillery at Ouistreham, to not mention right on a path to hit a bunch of rocky reefs.
Rocky reefs. That's a pretty good way to describe the basis of the relationship between the Free French forces and the rest of the United Nations alliance. Here's the thing, though. It's France the Allies are looking to liberate, and the French will have some part in all of this, for better or for worse.
Okay, so despite that de Gaulle has not gotten his full participation of the resistance, Chef SOE and French resistance chief Pierre Koenig have decided to call the resistance to arms across the whole country. They hope that this will disrupt the German response to the landings. Part of this plan centers on the Vercours Plateau. Lying just southwest of Grenoble, this enormous rock formation is roughly triangular in shape and about 50 kilometers north to south and 20 kilometers wide. It's over 1,000 meters high and bound almost on all sides by high walls. This makes it a natural fortress with just a few roads and footpaths providing access. Just 5,000 or so people live on the plateau, mainly farmers and loggers. But that number has been swelled by about 500 resistance fighters. These fighters are the men of the Maquis. The Maquis have their origins in the Service de Travail Obligatoire, the STO. Since February 1943, the Vichy forced labor program has dispatched up to 650,000 young Frenchmen to work in Germany. However, some 200,000 men, known as réfractaires, have escaped the clutches of the Vichy administration. Of these, some 50,000 have taken up the fight alongside the resistance. They've become maquisards. Most Maquis are based in the south and southeast, where the scrub-covered high ground, the hills, the mountains, and the caves are ideally suited for guerrilla warfare. Now, the 500 fighters in Vercours are getting ready to fortify their plateau into an enclave of a new French republic. René Piron is a maquisard who lives in Romans, a town just below the western wall of the plateau. He was awoken at midnight by his commander. I threw on my maquisard clothes and started mentally to check how many men we had and how many would now not come with us. We had to remember that we were asking them to abandon their families, their work, their security. I first woke up Comrade Chartier. I gave him the good news and told him to empty our secret magazine of all equipment and ammunition. I found my deputy already up and dressed, as were my section chiefs. At 5 o'clock, my sack on my back, I said goodbye to my wife and left home. She was very brave and uttered no syllable of complaint, which made leaving much easier. The Vercours maquisards have been building up their strength since early 1943 under austere conditions. In a cold winter, they have suffered a shortage of blankets, warm clothes, and boots, hiding in farmhouses or living in the forest, eating what little food the local farmers could supply. They have only received limited weapons and training from the SOE. The Germans have known that something is up. The Sicherheitsdienst and the Vichy milice have managed limited infiltration. Over the past few months, they have assaulted the villages and hamlets on the plateau. Farms and buildings have been burnt down, a handful of maquisards have been killed, and civilians have been executed in reprisals. But the Maquis have survived, mainly because the small independent units of about 10 men limits the damage the enemy can inflict in any one attack. The Maquis have also learned to be ruthless. They execute anyone who they believe has collaborated with the Germans. But how are these 500 ill-equipped, poorly resourced men planning to hold the plateau against the forces arrayed against them? Well, the Maquis are planning to hold out long enough that a force of 4,000 Allied paratroopers can be dropped in and reinforce them. They believe that these will come as part of an Allied invasion of southern France. Back in May, Eugène Chavon, the civilian leader of the Vercours Maquis, visited Algiers and obtained a signed letter from the French Committee of National Liberation, assuring that help would be coming. But although Chavon claims he has an oral agreement, this letter didn't explicitly state that this would include paratroopers. And with all of Chaf's resources focused on Normandy, we shall have to see what sort of assistance the Maquis of Vercours will get. For now, I'll leave you with the words of a Maquisard codenamed Yvon as he assembles with his fellow fighters. I can see their faces now, my comrades, on that morning of 6th of June, standing together in the darkness on the terrace in front of my house waiting for the truck. I can see their faces serious and determined, no bravado, just the cold resolution a man feels when he must leave behind all that he loves, all that he lives for, his wife, his children, his possessions. All left in danger, without either security or a sure means of living, all to be reduced to no more than dear memories held in the heart, all in the cause of doing our duty.
In boats racing towards the beaches right now are thousands of men whose duty, starting a half hour from now, will be to wade through water up to their chests, weighed down by full combat gear, walking straight into enemy fire.
Because as the 6th hour of Operation Neptune ends, despite aerial bombs and naval artillery, Corporal Naube and many, many more German soldiers are standing ready in their bunkers to receive the landing troops with hot lead and mighty explosions.
We shall see how that goes when we return for the 7th hour of D-Day.
Stephen Przybylski has dedicated this hour of D-Day to his father, Wacław Przybylski. Wacław Przybylski was born in Kalisz in central Poland on July 6, 1918, at a time when the Poles are still fighting to secure the borders and provinces of the newly formed Polish Republic. He excelled in school, but his family didn't have the money for him to go past the elementary school. He did not want to become a machinist's apprentice, so at the age of 14, he ran away from home for good. Surviving on odd jobs, he ended up joining the Sea Scouts. That took him to the Baltic port of Gdynia on the Scouts' training square rigger Dar Pomorza. In 1937, he joined the Polish Merchant Marine and was at sea on SS Wilno when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. The Polish government took a number of measures to stop its ships from falling into German hands in the event of invasion. For the Merchant Marine, the Polish Naval Headquarters had developed a special radio link in April to transmit a warning. In late August, that went off. All ships were warned to get out or stay out of the Baltic and head for British, French, or neutral ports. In any case, Wilno, with Wacław on it, was still in the Baltic on September 1st, but they managed to avoid the Kriegsmarine by hugging the Swedish and Danish coasts. Having made it to Norwegian waters, the Wilno was part of one of the first convoys of the war, with the Royal Navy escorting 8 ships to the relative safety of Scotland. Upon the outbreak of war, the Polish government took control of all Polish-flagged merchant shipping as part of the greater Allied coordinated effort, but the men aboard were all volunteers. Wacław's life as a merchantman was far from over, and he sailed in nearly 30 convoys across the North Atlantic and to the Mediterranean. He sailed on 4 Polish-flagged ships, 2 of which were sunk after he left them. He witnessed many ships in his convoys go down, seeing fellow merchantmen drowning or freezing in the icy depths before they could be rescued. Indeed, among the branches of service in the war, the Merchant Marine suffered among the greatest percentage of casualties. In 1942, Wacław was finally given the chance to finally complete his education and attend a Polish high school in Glasgow, and then the Sea Officers' College in London. But he returned to sea in 1944 aboard SS Kovel. It is one of a number of ships recently built in the United States to be transferred to the Polish Navy and Merchant Marine, and this day she sailed out from near Bristol as part of Operation Neptune, joining the Armada heading for Normandy. She is stationed about 5 miles off Omaha Beach, carrying small arms, ammunition, and general infantry supplies. Landing craft are to come alongside it, load up and drop off at depots on the beaches throughout D-Day and D+1. Kovel is one of the 1,260 merchant ships in the Neptune Armada, tasked with helping to supply the landing force. After doing his part to ensure the success of the Allied landings, Wacław will leave the Merchant Marine later in 1944 and return to Glasgow, this time for a degree in chemistry. He will meet and marry another Polish refugee enrolled at the university, Maria Kolaza. She will be working towards a doctorate and upon completion will be offered a position in Canada. Wacław and Maria will emigrate there in 1949. Eventually, they will become Canadian citizens and raise 2 boys in Ottawa. He will work as an analytical chemist in industry and for the Canadian government. He will pass away in April 2005.